I would like to read some excerpts from a scientific paper. It's called Sexual Orientation, Controversy and Science by J.M. Bailey and others, published in the journal Psychological Science in the Public Interest in 2016. I found this paper on the Living in Love and Faith website, and I'm reading from it because we want to be dealing with facts as far as we can, with reality. Well, this paper is an extensive survey of research into aspects of sexual orientation. It's peer-reviewed and thorough, and it has several conclusions. First, people who are sexually attracted to the same sex represent a minority of adults. Those with predominantly same-sex attractions comprise fewer than 5% of respondents in most Western surveys. Data from non-Western cultures are consistent with this conclusion. There's no persuasive evidence that the rate of same-sex attraction has varied much across time or place. A recent survey of 34,557 US adults yielded rates of 96.6% heterosexual, 1.6% gay or lesbian, and 0.7% bisexual. Additionally, 1.1% of respondents identified as something else or said they don't know the answer. These numbers are in reasonably close agreement with a recent review of 9 large, careful studies conducted in Western populations, which concluded that approximately 3.5% of US adults identified as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Several conclusions are possible with a high degree of confidence. First, Kinsey's famous survey likely overestimated the frequencies of non-heterosexual attractions and experiences. Second, individuals with incidental homosexual feelings and contacts are much more common than those with substantial, that is, persistent and strong feelings and frequent same-sex experiences. Third, individuals with a substantial homosexual feeling comprise a small, albeit non-trivial, minority of adults in Western developed nations, a smaller percentage than suggested by Kinsey's data from more than half a century ago, despite the remarkable increase in tolerance of homosexuality. This scientific research into orientation doesn't all rely upon self-report in answering surveys. It can involve far more objective methods, such as measuring blood flow, pupil dilation, and brain activity. But based on all these methods, it's concluded that people who are predominantly homosexual make up less than 5% of the population, according to evidence from both Western and non-Western cultures, and there's no particular reason to think that that has changed much through history. The evidence is it's a fairly fixed, small minority of people. Another conclusion of the study was this. Male and female sexual orientations differ in several respects. Women are more likely to report a bisexual than an exclusively same-sex orientation. Men show the opposite pattern. Men's sexual orientations are closely linked to their pattern of sexual arousal. Women's are not. Women appear more likely than men to experience same-sex attraction in the context of close, affectionate relationships, and their patterns of sexual attraction appear more likely to exhibit change over time. I guess when I think about it, that's not surprising. Men are more likely to be either strongly heterosexual or strongly homosexual, depending on what arouses them. Women are more interested in close, affectionate relationships, and their sexual attraction is affected by those relationships. Another conclusion is among the Western populations that have been studied, bisexual patterns of attraction are rarer in men than in women, and exclusively homosexual attractions are rarer in women than in men. The reason for this difference isn't known, but in this respect, men and women are different. Another part of the paper looks into causes of sexual orientation. Across many different cultures, male and female non-heterosexuality in adulthood tends to be preceded by childhood gender nonconformity, a pattern of behaviour somewhat like that of the other sex. Childhood gender nonconformity is a matter of degree, and it can range from subtle to extreme. Often it emerges at an early age despite conventional gender socialization. Among some adults, childhood gender nonconformity appears to persist into adulthood. That is, gay adults often experience being more like the other gender from childhood to some degree. Behavioral correlates of sexual orientation are present during childhood long before a child has any apparent sexual feelings. And childhood gender nonconformity usually emerges by preschool age. I'm reading from the paper again. No causal theory of sexual orientation has yet gained widespread report. The most scientifically plausible causal hypotheses are difficult to test. However, there's considerably more evidence supporting non-social causes of sexual orientation than social causes. This evidence includes the cross-culturally robust findings that adult homosexuality is strongly related to childhood gender nonconformity. In contrast, evidence for the most commonly hypothesized social causes of homosexual, such as sexual recruitment by homosexual adults, patterns of disordered parenting, or the influence of homosexual parents, is generally weak in magnitude and distorted by numerous confounding factors. Most of the evidence suggests that sexual orientation is hardwired, by which that doesn't necessarily mean a gay gene. No one knows if that's the reason. It's probably something more complicated. But the evidence seems to be saying that it's something that's not a choice, and it most likely isn't something that you're socialized into. We shouldn't be asking whether people choose to be gay, because even if it's not hardwired, that doesn't mean it's a choice. How you feel sexually is how you feel sexually. There is a small but persistent percentage of the human population which will experience same-sex attraction as a fixed part of their nature. That's what the science says. This is a paper written by people who have done collectively a huge amount of research into human sexuality and who are well regarded in their scientific communities. I don't think we have reason to doubt them. The question is, what do we do about it? If you think humans are primarily autonomous, that is, self-governing individuals, and the moral principle that matters most is individual freedom, then you'll conclude that people who experience same-sex attraction have the same right to follow their sexual inclination as anyone else, and anyone who disagrees with this is essentially immoral. This is what might be called an ethic of autonomy. It's based on the idea that people are fundamentally self-governing individuals who should be free to satisfy their wants, needs, and preferences. It's based on moral concepts such as rights, liberty, and justice. It follows ethicists such as Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill, and Peter Singer. This is the ethic predominantly believed in the Western world, and it's becoming stronger and more outspoken by the day, and it's now built into many legal structures. To us in the Western world, it seems that that is what is now accepted as entirely normal. However, it's useful to know that there is an acronym coined by the cultural psychologists Joe Enrich, Steve Hine, and Ara Norenzayan in 2010. They said, our culture is weird. That is, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. We are statistical outliers. In world terms, we are very much the minority. However, nearly all psychological research is based on us, and this weird group dominates US media and world entertainment. But the weirder you are in these terms, the more you see a world full of separate objects rather than relationships. You have an autonomous and independent concept of the self, and related to this is a difference in thinking style. Most people in the world think holistically. They see the whole context and relationships among parts. But weird people think more analytically. So it makes sense that philosophers since Kant generate individualistic, rule-based, universalist moralities. That's the morality you need to govern a society of autonomous individuals. If you see a world of individuals, you want a morality that protects individual rights, a morality of harm and fairness, that is, avoiding harm and being fair. But in a non-weird society, that is, the rest of the world, you see relationships, contexts, groups. You're not only concerned with protecting individuals, but relationships as well. And ideas of individual freedom are not enough. Outside Western society, there are two additional ethical frameworks. There's an ethic of community, based on the idea that people are fundamentally members of larger entities, families, teams, companies, tribes, or nations. And the larger group is real and matters, and people have obligations to it. This drives values such as duty, respect, reputation, and patriotism. In such societies, the Western insistence that people should design their own lives and pursue their own goals seems selfish and dangerous. There is also, in other cultures, an ethic of divinity that sees people as fundamentally vessels within which a divine soul has been implanted. People are not just animals with extra consciousness, they're children of God and should behave accordingly. There are things that violate the sacred order of the universe. And this drives moral concepts such as sanctity and sin and purity. And in this view, Western personal liberty looks like hedonism and a celebration of humanity's basest instincts. Now, these aren't my ideas. This is based on the work of Richard Schrader, the cultural psychologist. He was not investigating what is ethical per se. He just pointed out that people have different moral universes. Now, Christianity has elements of all three, or more accurately, we would say that each of these three echoes the truth of Christianity in some way. So, let us put it in our terms. If you think that humans are primarily created beings, made in the image of God, and that what matters most is glorifying God, then you will conclude that we should follow what He says, especially if you also think that we are fallen creatures, living in a fallen world, and that our thoughts and feelings can often go astray. Then it's especially important to listen to what God says. We are not fundamentally autonomous or self-governing beings. Freedom to follow our innate impulses and feelings is not the most important thing. Far more important is for us to follow what God says is important about being human. We recognize that we all have strong impulses and feelings, especially when it comes to sexuality, which is one of the deepest and strongest drives of all. However, we don't believe that even as deep and strong a human impulse as that is where our identity lies. Our identity is in who we were created to be, and even more importantly, who we are redeemed to be when we're redeemed from our sinfulness by Christ. It is in Christ that we find our foremost and final identity. It is in His teaching and that of His authorized apostles that we find out how to live out that identity. As people who also live in communities of those who are not yet redeemed, we may well have opinions about what's best for them and for our community. However, we also recognise that here in the West, as odd and statistically unrepresentative as it is, we must still accept that it is this weird culture that Western, educated, industrialised, rich and democratic people do primarily hold to an ethic of individual autonomy. We may not think it's good for people, but we can't change everything at once. We can certainly say that our views are as entitled to expression as anyone else's. After all, that's what an ethic of individual autonomy believes in. But we also accept that other people will believe in their right to individual expression of sexuality. We must also remember that preaching morality doesn't save anyone. Preaching Christ does. We can learn a lot from the work of Jonathan Haidt, the moral psychologist, in whose work I found out about a lot of these ideas, especially because he talks about how people come to their views and what changes their views. Part of the myth of the rationalistic West is that we are rational about moral views. Psychology proves that we are not. Most of us are driven by our emotions. That's just a fact of human nature. The most powerful part of our decision-making is emotional. That's for any moral issue and whatever side of it you're on. We have strong instincts about what's wrong or right, and it's the very unusual person who ever changes their instincts by reason. Mostly, what moves and shapes your instincts is the people around you, and frankly, what gets repeated to you most often. Remember that when you disagree with someone, trying to win an argument by logic when what drives people is deep emotion very likely won't work. It will just drive people apart. But we are Christians. We believe that God works by his Spirit to enlighten us. That as we read his word, his Spirit works in us to bring us to true understanding. People's minds can change, even in their deepest convictions, as the Spirit works in them. That's the case for you, as well as the people you might disagree with. So it's worth reading the Bible yourself, so that your mind and emotions and instincts are shaped by the Spirit. And it's worth reading it with others, so that together, in mutual trust, you might explore what God says. People may very well reject it at the first, but the Spirit can change people's minds. We live in a world in which sexuality is becoming an ever more highly charged issue. Emotions run deep and hot. But it's still God's world, so don't despair. We who have the unimaginable riches of God's word are not better than others. We just have the inestimable gift of God's grace, his insight that helps us to understand human nature and feelings, and his guidance that tells us how to act on them.